If you are looking for a slightly spooky, gothic, dark academia fall read, I have the perfect book for you. But before I get into that, let me know what one of your favorite books are that puts you in mind of fall. Fall is one of my favorite seasons. I actually like winter a little bit better, but I love the fall aesthetic. And I was so enthralled by this book. I think it might be a new favorite book of the year. I have just finished A Study in Drowning, which is a book that has so many layers. I feel like I could peel one back and discover something new every time I read it. This story is set roughly in 1930s Wales. At least that's the inspiration. I don't know that I would say that it's fully set in that location, but it is set at least in our world, taken with the inspiration of 1930s Wales. Our main character, Effie, is studying at university and she really loves literature, but women are not allowed to get into the literature college, but she is allowed to study to be an architect. So she studies to be an architect and she finds this opportunity where she can redesign her favorite author's house. So she takes the opportunity, she applies for it, she gets accepted, and she goes to redesign his house. He lives in a coastal town by the sea, and whenever she arrives there, she quickly starts to realize things are maybe not as they seem. She is also not the only student there. Whenever she arrives, she finds out that there is a literature student there, and he is dedicated to finding out whether or not our author is legit or whether or not he's a fraud. Our literature student is thinking that some things just aren't adding up. One of the reasons our main character Effie loves this author so much is he wrote about the Fairy King. In his book Angharad, which is like a national bestseller, he wrote about the perspective of a girl who outwits and triumphs over the Fairy King. And our main character has been seeing visions of the Fairy King since she was little, long before she read the book Angharad. And everyone doesn't believe her. They think that she is hallucinating, and she is on medication to help her sleep so she's not seeing these hallucinations and keeping her up at night, and to stop the hallucinations during the day. But when she arrives at this house on the coast, her hallucinations get worse. It's almost like the Fairy King's magic is stronger there. And she really has to figure out, we as a reader have to figure out whether or not she is for real, whether or not these hallucinations are real. And Effie wants to believe that they're real because she doesn't want to be crazy. But at the same time, she wants to be a normal person. This book is so atmospheric and it is written so beautifully. I wanted to write down quotes so much whenever I started this book, particularly the first half. I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many quotes in this book and I love all of them. And I was highlighting and making notes of them. But honestly, the further I got into the book, I just needed to know what happened and I didn't want to stop and highlight. This book is also very atmospheric. I really felt that I was at the seaside coast that the characters are also at. It just felt so real. Honestly, I read this book pretty much over the course of a day. It did take me 2 days, but I started it one day and then I read the majority of it the next day. And I really thought that it was like dark and stormy outside all day, but it wasn't. It was just because I was so absorbed in this book. I feel like there's so many layers to this book that I almost don't know where to begin, but I will start with the sea. The sea is almost a character in this book. And at the beginning of each chapter in A Study in Drowning, we get an excerpt from the book Angharad that our characters love so much. And one of the quotes from Angharad is, "The only enemy is the sea." And the sea just takes on almost a personality of its own. But it also is super layered. The author of the book Angharad, Emrys Myrddin, lived by the sea. His family were fishermen. They relied on the sea for survival. The sea was their livelihood. But the sea also brings destruction. This coastal village that they are on in this story has previously been flooded during a bad storm. And they literally call that flood the drowning, because it killed so many people in this coastal village, but also because it brought so much destruction. We also see that destruction literally in Emrys Myrddin's house. His house is dilapidated. The basement is flooded. It is literally rotting away. So the sea is this twofold thing. And I feel like that is such representative of pretty much everything in the story. Even the book on Harad, our protagonist absolutely loves this story, but she also sees it somewhat as a romance. The other student at this house that is studying Emrys Myrddin's legacy doesn't see Anharad as a romance. And it kind of reminds me a little bit about how people talk about Jane Eyre and how some people see Jane Eyre as this sweeping romance, and some people see Jane Eyre as Jane had to give up a part of herself, possibly her true self, to be with Mr. Rochester. And there's different readings of the story, and there's different layers, and you can interpret things different ways. This story also just gave me Jane Eyre vibes with like this girl stuck in this house at the sea, and there's something wrong in this house. Some things just aren't adding up. And then the gothic vibes that this book had, it did remind me of Jane Eyre a little bit. But I think this discussion of almost everything in this story has two sides is really important to the story itself. And I can't really explain why without spoilers, but it was awesome. Not only that, Effie really looks up to Emrys Myrddin. She literally says, this book saved my life. This book is her everything. This book gives her the inspiration to think that maybe one day she can overcome her own problems, her own struggles that she has in life. And yet, while she's here at this house, she starts to realize that Emrys Myrddin might not be the hero she believes he is. So there's also discussion of how we handle things when our heroes fail us, when there's two sides to things, where their work was so important to us, but they aren't who we hoped they would be. And yeah, I said the sea is almost a character in this story, but the book on Harad is also a character in this story in more ways than you expect. It is so well constructed, and I absolutely fell in love with this. There's not a really urgent sense of plot. This is a character story. This is about Effie, about her believing in herself and her growing up, learning, and overcoming her own struggles. I thought this book was absolutely beautiful. I will definitely be rereading this. Let me know some of your fall book recommendations in the comments, and let me know if you've read this book and what your thoughts are on A Study in Drowning, and I hope to see you in another video. Happy reading!